It was an ordinary Wednesday morning in Midland, Texas. October 14, 1987, the kind of morning where the sky is wide and pale and nothing seems particularly urgent. Jessica McClure was 18 months old. She had her mother's eyes and a laugh that could fill a room, and on that morning she was playing in the backyard of her aunt's home daycare while the adults moved in and out of the house doing what adults do, checking on children, making lunches, managing the beautiful, exhausting chaos of caring for toddlers. Nobody saw it happen. Nobody heard her go. One moment Jessica was there and the next moment she was not. And then, from somewhere beneath the earth came a sound that would change everything. The faint, muffled cry of a baby who had fallen 8 feet down into a narrow well casing no wider than 8 inches across. 8 inches? Stop and think about that for a moment. That is roughly the width of a standard piece of paper. And into that impossible space a child had slipped, silently, swiftly, without warning, and now she was wedged 22 feet underground in the dark, in the cold, in the silence of the Texas earth, and the world above her had no idea what to do. Her mother, Reba, heard the cries first. She ran to the backyard and immediately understood the unthinkable. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the opening and called down to her daughter. Jessica called back. She was alive. She was conscious. She was singing in those first moments, singing Winnie the Pooh, the song from the television show she loved, and the sound of that tiny voice rising up from the dark ground was at once the most heartbreaking and most miraculous thing anyone in that neighborhood had ever heard. Emergency services were called, firefighters arrived, and very quickly it became clear that this was not a problem that could be solved in an hour. This was not a problem that could be solved with any of the tools these first responders had brought with them. This was something different. This was something that would require more people, more equipment, more ingenuity, more endurance than anyone in Midland, Texas had ever been asked to provide. The well had been used for water years earlier and had been covered at some point, but the cover had been moved or had fallen away, and the casing that remained was a narrow, vertical tube of hard rock and compressed earth, just wide enough for a toddler to slip through but far too narrow for any adult to follow. The rescue workers who surrounded the opening understood immediately that they could not simply reach in and pull her out. They could not send anyone down after her. They could not widen the shaft without risking a collapse that might kill her instantly. They were standing above a child who was alive, who was talking, who was singing, and they could not get to her. The horror of that situation is almost impossible to fully comprehend. 22 feet, less than the distance of a long jump, less than the height of a two-story building, and yet it might as well have been a mile. The decision was made to drill a parallel shaft alongside the existing well, then bore a horizontal tunnel across to reach her. It was the only option that made sense. It was also an enormously difficult engineering challenge, because the ground beneath Midland is a particular kind of stubborn Texas rock, caliche, a calcium carbonate cemented sediment that is extraordinarily hard and unforgiving. Every inch of that tunnel would have to be fought for. Every foot of progress would take hours. And all the while, 22 feet down in the dark, a baby girl was waiting. What happened next is the part of this story that transforms it from a local tragedy into something that belongs to all of us, because the cameras came. The television cameras arrived and they set up their lights at the edge of that well and they began to broadcast, and America stopped. Not figuratively, not in the abstract way we talk about cultural moments capturing the national imagination. People actually stopped. They stopped going out. They stayed home. They sat in front of their televisions and they watched, hour after hour, as the rescue crews worked through the night and into the next day and into the night after that. CNN, then still a relatively young network, still proving its concept, still showing the world what live television could be, broadcast coverage of the rescue nearly continuously for 58 hours. 58 hours. No scripted drama. No manufactured tension. Just a hole in the ground in Texas and the people who were trying to reach the child inside it, and a nation that could not look away. Why did this particular story reach into people so deeply and hold them so completely? There have been many tragedies, many disasters, many moments of collective grief and fear throughout history. But something about baby Jessica, that is what the world came to call her, baby Jessica, the name carrying all the tenderness and urgency of the moment. Something about her situation activated something primal in every person who heard about it. She was so small. The problem was so vivid and so concrete. You did not need to understand politics or economics or history to understand what was happening. A baby had fallen into a well. People were trying to get her out. That was the whole story, stripped of all complexity, laid bare in its most human form, a child in danger and the adults scrambling to save her. every parent who watched saw their own child. Every person who had ever been afraid of the dark felt something ancient stir in their chest, and so they watched, all of them, together. The rescue team grew by the hour. Local volunteers showed up. Mining experts were called in. Drilling companies sent their best equipment and their most experienced operators. The city of Midland, which had been suffering through the collapse of the Texas oil boom, which had been watching its economy contract and its people struggle, suddenly found itself at the center of something larger than economics, something larger than local politics or regional pride. A child needed help, and so help came. Workers drilled in shifts around the clock, stopping sometimes when the vibrations threatened to shift the rock in dangerous ways, then starting again when the engineers determined it was safe to continue. The noise was constant, the grinding of machinery, the cracking of caliche, the voices of men calling to each other above the roar, and beneath it all, faint but persistent, the voice of a little girl. She talked to them in those first hours. She talked and she sang, and sometimes she cried and sometimes she went quiet, and the moments of quiet were the ones that sent ice through everyone's veins. Rescuers rigged a microphone and a speaker system to communicate with her. They lowered food and water on a string, a taco, fruit, crackers, juice. Small offerings slipped down through the impossibly narrow shaft to where she was wedged in the dark. They lowered a light so she would not be in total darkness. They talked to her constantly. The voices of strangers filtered down through rock and earth, telling her she was going to be okay, telling her that people were coming, telling her to hold on. And Jessica, with the unfathomable resilience of a child who does not yet know how to despair, held on. The nation held on with her. The vigil that formed around television screens across America was unlike anything that had preceded it in the modern era. This was 1987, remember, before the internet, before social media, before the thousand fractured channels of information that now compete for our attention every second of every day. There were three major networks and CNN had the story, and so that is where people went. They gathered in living rooms and bars and break rooms. They called each other on the phone to share updates. They prayed in churches and they lit candles and they sent money and letters and stuffed animals to Midland, as if the physical act of sending something, of contributing something tangible to this distant rescue, could somehow help. Midland received so much mail in those 58 hours that the post office was overwhelmed. People needed to do something. They needed to feel connected to what was happening. And the only way to do that was to watch and to wait and to hope. President Ronald Reagan was briefed on the situation. He called the family. His press secretary was asked about it at a briefing. The rescue of baby Jessica had become, in those hours, a matter of national concern in the most literal sense. It had risen to the level of the presidency, not because of any political significance, but because it had captured the heart of the country so completely that it would have been impossible for the most powerful person in the nation to ignore it. The entire machinery of American public life had oriented itself toward a hole in the ground in Midland, Texas. Meanwhile, the drilling continued. The parallel shaft went down, foot by difficult foot, through rock that seemed determined to resist. The horizontal tunnel was even harder. Boring sideways through caliche required specialized bits and constant adjustment and an engineering precision that left no margin for error. The workers who operated the equipment did so with a consciousness of what was at stake that few human beings ever have to carry. One wrong move, one miscalculation. One moment of exhaustion leading to a misjudgment, and the tunnel collapses and the child is gone. They carried that weight through every shift. They carried it through the cold Texas nights and the long October days, and they did not stop and they did not quit, and slowly, agonizingly, the tunnel grew. Jessica, for her part, was doing something remarkable. She was surviving, not just surviving, she was adapting. Her position in the well was not a comfortable one. She had slipped in feet first and come to rest with her right foot folded up above her head and her body wedged tightly into the rock. It was a position that would cause circulation problems that would eventually cause significant damage to her right foot, but she was talking. She was sleeping in short intervals. She was accepting the food that was lowered to her. She was, in the particular way of very young children who have not yet learned the cultural expectations around catastrophe, simply being present, alive, enduring. There is something in that which strips away every pretension we build around suffering and leaves only the bare fact of it, a child enduring, waiting to be found. The moment the tunnel broke through is the moment that has been replayed and described and remembered more than any other in this story. October 16, 1987, 56 hours after Jessica fell. The drill broke through the rock into the narrow space beside her, and suddenly the rescuers could see her. They could actually see her, real, physical, small, covered in dirt and exhaustion, but alive. The paramedic who was chosen to go into the tunnel, a man named Robert O'Donnell, who was small enough to fit through the horizontal shaft and trained enough to handle what he would find there, made his way through the rock to reach her. He worked in that impossibly confined space with no room to maneuver, reaching through crumbling caliche to get his hands on this child. He had to physically manipulate her body inch by inch, to work her loose from the well casing that had held her for 2.5 days. It took another hour. Another hour of the world holding its breath. Another hour of her mother waiting at the surface of the cameras filming, of the nation watching. And then Jessica McClure emerged from the earth. She came up through the tunnel and was lifted into the night air. And the crowd that had gathered around that well, rescuers, reporters, neighbors, strangers who had driven from across the region to be there, erupted. They wept. Grown men who had been drilling rock for 2 days straight wept without embarrassment, without restraint, in front of the cameras and in front of each other, and it did not matter because this was one of those moments when the pretense of composure simply cannot hold. Jessica was placed on a stretcher. She was whisked to a waiting ambulance. She was taken to Midland Memorial Hospital where doctors had been standing ready for 2 days. She was alive. The images of her rescue spread instantly across newspapers, across television screens, across the world. The photograph of her being lifted from the ground, grimy and dazed and alive, became one of the iconic images of that decade. It appeared on front pages everywhere. It was shared and reprinted and discussed in 100 languages. In a year that had been marked by political tension and economic uncertainty and the general ambient anxiety of the Cold War's final years, here was something unambiguous. Here was a baby, and here were people who had not stopped for 58 hours until they got her out. That was the whole story, and it was enough. But there is more to this story than the rescue. There is the aftermath, which is always the harder chapter to tell because the cameras eventually go away and the complications remain. Jessica spent several weeks in the hospital. Doctors had to amputate part of her right foot, the one that had been folded above her head for those 2.5 days, deprived of circulation, damaged beyond saving. She would carry that physical mark of her ordeal for the rest of her life. She has spoken about it as an adult with a matter-of-factness that is itself remarkable. It is simply part of who she is, part of her body, part of the story she carries. She does not seem to regard it with bitterness, but it is there. The world that celebrated her rescue did not always think about what rescue costs. She grew up in Midland. She married. She had children of her own. She became in her adult life a private person living a life largely removed from the story that had made her famous before she was 2 years old. She has given occasional interviews over the years, always thoughtful, always measured, always clearly aware that she's carrying something that belongs not just to her but to the millions of people who watched and waited and wept. She does not remember the fall, of course. She does not remember the well or the voices of the rescuers or the microphone or the taco that someone lowered down to her on a string. She knows the story only as we all do, from the outside, from the footage, from what other people have told her. But she lived it. She was the center of it, and she has the scar to prove it. Robert O'Donnell, the paramedic who crawled through that tunnel to reach her, his story did not end as neatly as Jessica's. He received medals and recognition and appeared on television and was celebrated as the hero he undeniably was. But the experience marked him deeply in ways that are not always visible from the outside. He struggled with depression in the years that followed. He struggled with the particular weight of having done something extraordinary once and then having to return to ordinary life. He died in 1995 of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 37 years old. The story of baby Jessica has a hero, and that hero suffered quietly in the aftermath of his heroism, and we should not forget that either. Rescue is not a clean narrative. The people who perform extraordinary acts under extraordinary pressure carry those acts with them long after the cameras have gone. The Midland of 1987 is also worth remembering in its full context. This was a city in pain. The oil boom that had made it prosperous had collapsed, and thousands of families were struggling with unemployment and foreclosure and the particular despair of watching a promised future evaporate. Into that struggling city came this story, a story of cooperation, of community, of every available resource being thrown at a single shared purpose, and it mattered. It mattered to the people of Midland in a way that went beyond the rescue itself. For those 58 hours, their city was not a struggling oil town in economic freefall. It was a place where people came together. It was a place where strangers drilled through rock for 2 days straight because a child needed them to. That is not a small thing. That kind of collective purpose is rare, and the people who lived it did not forget it. The broader cultural impact of the baby Jessica rescue is something that media scholars and sociologists have written about for decades now. It is often cited as one of the early demonstrations of the power of live, continuous television news coverage, the proof of concept that CNN needed to establish itself as a serious journalistic force. The moment that showed what 24-hour news could be when it had something worth covering. It changed how news organizations thought about live event coverage. It changed how audiences related to news, not as something you caught up with at 6 o'clock in the evening, but as something that was happening right now that you could be present for, that you could watch unfold in real time. In that sense, the baby Jessica rescue is a hinge point in the history of American media. It is one of the moments when the way we consume reality shifted, and there was no shifting back. It also became a cultural touchstone in a way that persists into the present. References to baby Jessica appear in films, in television shows, in novels, in political speeches, in everyday conversation, as shorthand for a particular kind of collective national experience. The experience of strangers becoming united around a shared crisis, of watching something terrible happening and feeling it as your own. When writers and filmmakers want to evoke that quality of communal feeling, that sense of a nation holding its breath together, they reach for baby Jessica. She became a symbol before she was old enough to understand symbols. There is something in this story that speaks to a very deep human truth, something about what we are underneath all the noise and division and complexity of modern life. When a child is in danger, we stop. We put down whatever we are doing. We stop disagreeing about politics and stop worrying about money and stop performing the thousand small vanities of daily existence, and we pay attention. We lean toward the screen. We hold our breath. We hope. That capacity, the capacity to be drawn out of ourselves by the suffering of a stranger, especially a small and helpless stranger, is not nothing. It is actually one of the better things about us. It is the thing that made people stay home from work to watch a rescue in Texas. It is the thing that made miners and drillers and paramedics work themselves to exhaustion for a child they had never met. It is the thing that made a nation weep when that child came up out of the earth, dirty and alive and blinking in the light. Baby Jessica is in her late 30s now. She has lived a life that stretches far beyond the 58 hours that made her famous. She has lived through the ordinary complexity of growing up and falling in love and raising children and facing loss, and doing all the things that human beings do when the cameras are gone and the story is over and real life, messy, ambiguous, beautiful real life, continues. She has carried the scar on her foot. She has carried the weight of a story that everyone knows and that she herself can barely remember. She has carried it, by all accounts, with grace. And in Midland, Texas, there is still a memorial at the site where it happened. People still visit. They still bring flowers and toys and stand at the edge of where that well once was, and they think about what happened there, about the 18-month-old girl who fell into the earth, and the people who refused to leave her there, and the country that watched and waited and held its breath for 2.5 days. They think about what it means to care about someone you have never met. They think about what it means to show up. That is what this story is about at its deepest level. Not just a rescue, not just a media event, not just a moment in the history of television news. It is about the showing up. It is about all those drillers who came to Midland and worked through the cold October nights without knowing if it would be enough. It is about the paramedic who crawled through a tunnel in the rock because a child was on the other side of it. It is about the mother who knelt at the edge of that well and talked to her daughter through the earth, keeping her voice steady because steadiness was the only gift she had to give. It is about the millions of people who could not do anything useful from where they were sitting except watch, and who watched anyway because watching was a form of witness and witness was a form of love. Jessica McClure fell into a well on a Wednesday morning in October 1987. She was 18 months old. She came out 58 hours later alive, changed, beginning the long life she would go on to live. And for those 58 hours, a nation forgot its divisions and its distractions and its many preoccupations, and it leaned toward a hole in the ground in Texas, and it hoped with everything it had. And she made it out, she made it out.